Today on the Recipients, I'm talking with the fabulous Ebe Ganon. And Ebe is the recipient of the 2024 National Awards for Disability Leadership Award for Change Making. This is always a hotly contested award. I'll tell you a bit about the Change Making Award. It's for achieving greater equality for disabled people by changing policy, programs, or legislation. Now, Ebe Ganon is a young disability advocate, sessional academic, and community engagement practitioner who is passionate about improving the state of inclusion in education, employment, and fitness settings. We might get to that. Through media engagement, policy submissions, conference appearances, and directorship, Ebe has played an instrumental role in affecting the necessary cultural change for people with disability to be seen as a priority cohort in tertiary sector reforms. Ooh. Welcome, Ebe. Great to have you along.
Thanks, Christina. Great to catch up.
Absolutely. And I think we can agree that the tertiary sector is one that we actually need some serious reform in to be more accessible, more inclusive, far more diverse. The number of DLI members who talk to us every day about whether they're academics or students, about the challenges, the barriers, the roadblocks they face. Oh my goodness, indeed. So how did you get into this work? What drove you to, fixing the tertiary sector to make it better? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I suppose all roads kind of led to this for me. And throughout my career so far, I keep getting rerouted back to doing work in tertiary education. I started my first tertiary degree in 2016. I moved from Perth to Canberra to start an ill-fated law degree at ANU in Canberra. I very quickly realised that that was not the place for me. And maybe 3 or 4 degree changes later, I ended up graduating with a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Arts. Throughout that time, I was kind of going through that period that lots of disabled folk go through where, some of us who are leaving home and starting to learn how to manage their conditions themselves and learning how to advocate for themselves and what they need. That period of university was really that was the defining feature, particularly of my first couple of years of university, and had a couple of not fantastic experiences along the way that kind of just sat in the back of my brain and festered there. Fast forward through the pandemic, I ended up engaging for the first time with Children and Young People with Disability Australia and had the opportunity to I suppose, design and lead a range of different consultation activities and eventual development of policy recommendations around those young people's experiences in tertiary education, which was, I think, the turning point where I realised, oh, this isn't just a me issue, this isn't just a Canberra issue or an ANU issue, this is systemic, and systemic problems need systemic solutions, which kind of started me on the journey towards the kind of work that I'm doing now.
Change making. Fantastic. It's interesting, isn't it? You talk about that that sort of discovery path that in some ways we all travel along as disabled people around realizing that I have to work out how to live with this and actually do stuff. So that's the disability leadership part of it, as we would say. That how do I get out there in the world and do my thing and follow what I want to do while actually being a disabled person who's not constantly, having to take time out to recover. But you also talk about that realization that making change, that actually, approaching it from a systems point of view, looking at how the system needs to be addressed, is something that we come to the realization of. And what we know, of course, is that isn't something that everybody comes to. Most people just never arrive at that. They only focus on fixing it for themselves, or or just not having the energy or the wherewithal at the time, which is completely fine, of course, to tackle the big picture part of it. How have you adjusted your view to be looking at it in a systemic way? And what has that involved in engaging further beyond your current space? And particularly as a disabled person, being able to sustain that.
Mm.
Not a small
A few,
questionnaire. Okay. Yeah.
a few good sub questions there. It, I think for me, looking at things as a big picture and as a dynamic where lots of different systems and systems of power and cultural expectations are interacting has kind of always been the way that I've looked at the world. The first time I heard the word advocate or advocacy was when I was very young. I was thinking about it before we jumped onto the call. I would have been 6 or 7, and my grandmother, who had done a lot of advocacy and service work in her community throughout her life, said, "Oh, you'd be a very good advocate, Rebecca." Which is my full name. And I didn't know what an advocate was, and she described it to me as, kind of a lawyer, but without a law degree, and they stand up for people. And I think that from that point, I sort of saw myself as someone who stands up for people, which is a very, I suppose, a very child way of understanding, kind of what that is. But having been surrounded by people from a very young age who stand up for people and who do work at a systems level, my dad, he started in investment banking and then ended up kind of working in corporate finance from a more strategic and business development sense. A lot of my family are allied health practitioners who have then ended up going on to kind of management positions where they then look at things from the kind of organization or the business level rather than the individual care level. So I've always had that sort of influence. I think the other thing is when you are a disabled person, or at least for me, a lot of us go through this arc of, oh, this must be my fault. Like the fact that this isn't working must be my fault. And there must be something that I'm doing that is meaning that I'm not getting the same results or I'm not getting outcomes that are the same as other people. And I think that when I attended university, it was the first time that I'd connected with other people who had similar or related experiences to me, connecting with other students through, the University Disability Collective in particular. And then that was a bit of a moment of realization. It's like, oh no, that's not me. That's like the system that has been totally stacked up against all of us, because here we are, this diverse group of young people looking to try and gain the skills to go and do something in the world, operating in an institution that has been designed by white, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied men, largely. And here we are trying to make it work, where we've designed all of these structures and systems and policies that don't take into account the way that life works for us and the way that we interact for the world. And I think that kind of approach to life and approach to understanding the world made traditional pathways of employment quite challenging for me. I tried for a really long time to kind of force myself into the kind of full-time ongoing, classic Canberra public service / university professional staff kind of pathway. But I just kept experiencing varying degrees of burnout of, here I am trying to do this little tweaking work over here. Here I am trying to, change this little thing or design this little dinky program over here. But actually the whole system's stacked up against us. And what we need to do is solve the problems from the top, and look at the cultures that are operating up in the executive and in management and in, the senior executive bands, and look at fixing things from the top down. Not saying that grassroots, change is not important, because it absolutely is. And usually it's the grassroots change that provides the impetus and the momentum to do that senior work. But sitting in those roles where, for at least earlier in my career, I didn't necessarily have the ability to do that big systems work, I found that really, really challenging. And perhaps I've made myself a little bit unemployable by being like that, but that's life. And I'm freelancing now and I'm really enjoying that. But yeah, that kind of talked around a few of your questions all together. I hope that was useful.
I'm just having a moment, folks, of loving Ebe describing the importance of disability leadership, because that's what's just happened there, and that need for us to fundamentally smash the state, Ebe, from the top, because if we keep pushing from the bottom, the people at the top are still there. And you're talking about universities who are fundamentally one of the last great patriarchal institutions that we've still got. And of course, ableism is very much a patriarchal construct. To fit into this patriarchal system, we must operate a certain way, we must be certain types of people. Being male helps because it's the patriarchy. So, the system's built to suit those people who identify as male. All of that space that's, fundamentally, it's not just being disabled people, but actually being not male gendered, and all of those things that stack up against us. And I was really interested there in how you talked about the need to address the top and the culture at the top. And of course, we talk about that a lot at the Disability Leadership Institute. And I mean, that's the reason we exist in the first place, is because we need to be doing it as a leadership thing. So what are you doing right now? What's sort of the focus, the big deal right now that's sort of landing in your view?
Yeah, I think the main projects and the main space that I'm working in at the moment is legislative reforms around higher education governance and policy. So I'm spending a fair bit of time, paid and a lot of unpaid, as is often the case, participating in working groups, roundtables, formal and informal conversations with people of varying levels of seniority who are responsible for those higher education policies, and trying to make the case for, I suppose, both disability representation in that decision making, but also just keeping people with disability at the forefront of the considerations when decisions are getting made about different changes and different systems and structures. At the moment, listeners might be aware of the recently announced Commonwealth prac payment, which is an initiative by the Department of Education to help alleviate placement poverty for people who have to complete compulsory practicals as part of their degree. At the moment, the program is very limited, which is a bit of a problem. It's targeted predominantly at nursing, teaching, and social work students in particular degree formats, and it's only being delivered to domestic students, not international students. So there's a lot of really challenging, guardrails within that policy setting. But within those guardrails, my priority is making sure that students with disability are represented in that conversation, and that the unique experiences of students with disability that can be compounded by experiences of placement poverty, for example, which for those who are not have not had the joy of being engaged in that conversation, placement poverty is the effect of when you need to take time off work or quit your job for the sake of completing, 30 hours a week of unpaid placement, which for a lot of people can lead to experiences of poverty. But for students with disability, there's a lot of additional considerations there. Placement is just more expensive for students with disability in general. Placement means that if you need to relocate yourself, students with disability who have additional needs around the kind of accommodation that they require and the sort of supports they require, they incur a lot of additional cost. One of the big advocacy points I've been looking at in and around that project is some of the eligibility settings for that particular payment presuppose a capability of being able to perform a particular amount of work during the week to be able to be eligible for the payment. And so looking at the reality of the fact that actually a lot of students with disability can't work full-time hours and therefore are not necessarily going to be able to hit those eligibility criteria. Some students with disability have their placement hours reduced as reasonable adjustments to their learning, but that shouldn't impact their ability to access support. And I think what I've noticed over the last couple of months of not just working around the CPP, but also the broader universities accord reforms. It's a big suite of different things that are going on in higher education at the moment. I have noticed a bit of a shift in not just people being willing to listen about disability and the experience of students and staff with disability, but actively asking about it and actively starting to bring people into the room. So I'm seeing change, which is really exciting. You know, I haven't been in this space for as long as others, just simply based on, you know, years around the sun. But I think in the short period of time I've been engaged in this space over the last few years, I am starting to see a shift. But the next step is seeing that change in attitudes start to move towards actual change on the ground and actual change in policy settings. So I have hope.
That's exciting. And as you're talking, I'm hearing a lot of similarity with we've got some other DLI members who are academics, and they've now got a new national kind of disabled academics kind of collective of some kind. I can't remember the name of it. But many of those issues are not dissimilar. That thing about the insistence on full-time work, the workload can be enormous when in fact, for many disabled people, that's just not a viable option. Doesn't mean we're less effective. It just means we work differently, folks. And that extra layer as well of the expectation that unless you can actually do some of those things, then your career is never going to advance. You're never going to actually get anywhere. But as you were talking, and we were talking earlier about leadership and the importance of leadership, I'm really aware of that space where if we don't have disabled academics as part of the university power structure, moving into the executive, moving into the chancellor's suites, and those sorts of the administration of universities, then that culture shift is also not potentially ever going to happen, which impacts the ability for it to happen at the student level as well.
Correct. Yeah, it's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment because I'm in my whilst on the professional staff side of things and administrative staff side of things in universities, I had kind of, started and, furthered a career in that space. I'm very early in my research career. I haven't started a PhD yet, and, I'm hoping to do that at some point over the next year or so. So if anyone's listening who's got an interesting DECRA or some money for a PhD student to do some fun systemic policy work, then hit me up. But what I am hearing and seeing and experiencing myself is at universities, rightfully so, there's a lot of changes happening around offering early career and sessional academics more permanent and ongoing employment opportunities. And that's really fantastic because the tertiary sector has been a place where lots of people have been very precariously employed for very, very long periods of time. And that's not an acceptable state of affairs. So what is happening to address that is many universities are moving towards implementing full-time ongoing positions or part-time ongoing positions that are education focused. And typically most universities are taking an approach where sessional academics who've done work at that university over the last couple of years are eligible to apply for those roles, etc. And, if you're lucky, you get to take on one of those roles. But what that is having, I think, probably an unintended consequence around is that there are fewer and fewer and fewer casual and non-ongoing opportunities to engage in employment and build up that experience. So I was doing a lot of marking this year at the university that I've been working and studying at, and that was a really great way to dip my toe in and kind of understand, how these courses are working, what good pedagogy looks like, in some cases what bad pedagogy looks like, what being in the academy is like, being exposed to researchers and building up my networks. What is starting to happen is those casual opportunities are drying up because they're being centralised into those ongoing roles, which, for example, I applied for one. I got quite far in the selection process. I was told I would need to relocate to Melbourne. I can't do that for many reasons, some of which are disability related. So that's now not an opportunity for me. Here in Canberra, we don't have any disability studies faculties at any university. So that kind of, stamps on my career progression opportunities here. And I'm sure that there, people have similar stories at lots of other institutions, where actually for people with disability, those casual employment opportunities are really, really helpful. They're very flexible. You complete the hours when you can and when you have capacity. That was so important for me this year. And they are kind of a foot in the door, because oftentimes folk with disability haven't necessarily had the same opportunities to build the same networks and be in the same rooms, because of compounding experiences of marginalisation throughout their life. So that's a long way of saying I think there's a big risk at the moment that we are shutting doors, to not just people with disability, but to people who, for other reasons, have been historically excluded from institutions like universities. Because you're right that having people with disability in those senior academic positions as professors, is really, really, really important, to the experience of everyone. The professoriate, I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand. The professoriate in universities are very, very powerful. They're very much the only part of the university that can send really strong signals around management and actually be listened to, aside from the senior management groups themselves. And so not having representation in those tiers, can have lots of consequences for the cultures that we build up in these institutions. But I can nerd out about that conversation for a really long time, and I won't, but
That's okay. That's
very important.
No, it's interesting because that's it's almost a really good example of the broader barriers. And I'm always interested in talking about barriers to disability leadership and the roadblocks that we face. But that broader space where, if the expectation of relocation, the expectation of even the thing where traveling regularly to go to conferences and stuff like that, some of those sorts of things that happen that for many of us as disabled people, these are just not feasible options. And apart from the income aspect of it, the poverty aspect of it, and half of us don't work, of course, half of all disabled people don't work, everybody, just in case you'd forgotten that. But that space where, we're not on a level playing field to actually play. So, we're not able to afford to buy into the networks, the expensive membership fees, those networks. We're not able to travel to the conferences where not just the registration fees are enormous, but actually traveling for disabled people is such an expensive thing. And, relocating means that, your entire medical and support team has to be re-established in a new location, and all of those sorts of things that people just don't think about. When the hardest thing you've ever had to do is find a new mechanic for your car, that just doesn't cut it with some of the equipment that some of us get around with. So it's that space that I think people think inclusion is really just an attitude and changing the recruitment process a little bit, tweaking it here and there, when in fact it's that bigger space of how we structure the work and how people succeed, in inverted commas, in any chosen career.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. I used to work for a state government kind of internal inclusion function, and obviously when you get exposed to that kind of environment, you can see all of these, systems and assumptions that are operating to either intentionally or unintentionally. The optimistic part of me says unintentionally, but the jaded part says intentionally, marginalised people who have always been marginalised in those spaces. And then the problem with trying to do that work from the inside is that you are subject to all of those same cultures and assumptions that are operating. There are people who become very senior, and I'm not speaking about anyone in particular, just patterns that I've observed. People who can't become very senior by maintaining the status quo and get promoted because they're happy to maintain the status quo. And then when they're the decision makers, maintaining the status quo becomes their best interest, because that is how they maintain their position and they maintain power over the kind of large branch or large whatever it is that they are now responsible for. And for the people who are not interested in maintaining the status quo, you become the problem. And you become identified as someone who is going to disrupt the flow and disrupt the way that we do things. And I think that for a lot of senior leaders, it's a bit of frog in the pot syndrome to some extent. They very, very slowly become part of the establishment such that they haven't quite realized that that's what's happening. And so when they start to feel threatened by somebody who is, challenging that establishment, they don't feel like they're being the establishment. They just feel like they're doing good management. But, I don't think that quashing disruption or quashing challenges or quashing difficult questions is particularly good management in my view. But yes, that's a really challenging dynamic to kind of disrupt, because there are lots of very, very senior people who are very, very comfortable and taking some very nice salaries and, making a big deal out of things that perhaps don't need to exist. And that's taking up their time. And they're very happy to kind of do busy work and, just get through the day and get through the week. But yeah, I don't know if that's a nice life, or if that's a particularly fulfilling life that, I perhaps wouldn't want for myself. But who am I to judge others who have built those very nice, comfortable careers for themselves? Perhaps that's my freelancer talking.
Absolutely. Well, it pays the mortgage, I suppose. And as they say, you don't get innovation without disruption, without challenge, without looking at our own paradigm and why we're sitting inside it, all of that space. How do you think receiving this award will change your work, or what difference might it make?
One of the big barriers that I face still is my age in a lot of these spaces. I rock up often the youngest person in the room by anywhere from 5 years to 20 years. I don't have a PhD, so I don't get to call myself doctor. And arguably, I've kind of rocketed through the first few years of my career, got a lot of experience very, very quickly. And I'm now in the process of consolidating that. And for those who've been along the journey with me, they understand how I've acquired that experience, and they kind of understand how my brain works. Part of that sort of rocketing through the career thing seems to resonate with other neurodivergent folk that I speak to. And those of us who are highly analytical and highly engaged in pattern recognition tend to have a similar experience, at least for those who I've shared that with. And so being able to be recognised by a respected institution like the DLI for the work that I've been doing provides me with a nod from a group of very respected leaders who have a strong track record in the space like yourself, and gives me the credibility to keep moving through the space. And on an individual level, I think a lot of what I had been doing felt very invisible, as a lot of this kind of systems work does, because attending a 90-minute working group with 3 public servants and a whole range of tertiary sector stakeholders is not sexy and doesn't look nice on LinkedIn. And so if we spoke about every time that happened, I think I would lose half the followers that I've slowly managed to build up, because it's boring.
You can do a nice photo, a lovely selfie, or
it's
key points,
Yeah, but it's it's boring, and for a lot of those meetings, it's 90% of it could have been an email, and then 10% of it was actually really crucial, and it was a really, really fantastic conversation that really moved us forward. And this award was a bit of an opportunity to make some of that visible, and to help people who perhaps haven't been engaged in the disability inclusion and leadership imperative to think about actually, it's not just about being a DEI leader, and it's not just about saying that we like inclusion, and it's not just about, writing our values on our website. It's like actually some of this really sometimes mundane sometimes, challenging work that happens behind the scenes, to attend or to get called for 15 minutes when you're not on retainer by some government department when they're trying to sense check, phrasing in their legislation. Sometimes that is what it looks like. And I hope that, being given this platform it has been a great opportunity to start to make that visible. And I hope to be able to continue to do that into the coming years, and hopefully bring more and more people into this advocacy space, because we talk a lot about inclusive education in an early childhood and in a primary setting. Tertiary education doesn't necessarily get the same kind of airtime in that list. Certainly in the past, government hasn't given it that kind of airtime. And having this platform to be able to raise people's awareness of the fact that this work is happening and it's important, and it's equally important to the rights of disabled people as early childhood and primary education, because if we don't have higher education opportunities to aspire to that are going to be inclusive and accessible to us and give us the opportunity to further our skills where we choose to, we don't have something to aspire to. So I think this has been a really, really important platform to kind of showcase some of this work that lots and lots of people have been working on for a long time. And I'm just one person who happens to be in this very long series of advocacy in this space.
Absolutely. Yeah, changing the world is not a solo action. Absolutely. You bet, she says from experience. Yeah. What's next? You mentioned a PhD and the desire to do that, but what's the new year going to bring?
Yeah, so currently exploring opportunities to do a PhD. Like lots of us, I have so many disparate interests and lots of different areas I'd love to follow up research in, ranging from continuing my master's research in the experience of students with disability at universities to, inclusive employment opportunities from more of a kind of leadership perspective. There's lots of research out there about entry-level employment and entry-level inclusive employment, but a lot less around middle and senior management and executive leadership. So that's a potential space. I also moonlight in the fitness industry, and so there's a potential opportunity to do something that is really radical around critical disability theory and applying that in fitness. So lots of doors to potentially knock on there. And then I've also just been appointed as the board chair of Children and Young People with Disability Australia. So that is something, thank you. That's something that's going to take up a lot of time next year that I'm really, really excited about. We've just launched our new strategic plan. And so next year, 2025, is very much a year of doing and implementing, which is more broadly reflective of, I suppose, what's happening in the broader disability reform space. We've had a lot of chat over the last couple of years, royal commissions, NDIS reviews, all those sorts of things. The time for chat is done. In my mind, I think we actually just need to get down to brass tacks and start implementing things and co-designing things, and installing excellent disability leaders into positions of authority and just getting it done.
Yeah, let's just do it.
Yep.
Yes, it's this. I'm very excited. I love having these conversations. I could do them all day, but we are almost out of time, which is, alas, a reality. Oh dear. And I really could talk about this for the rest of the day. I always like to ask a question before we finish up, though, Ebe. Who is a leader that you admire and why?
That's a great question. There's a few leaders that have been really influential for me this year, but I think the most influential leader for me this year has been the manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, Darlene McLennan. Darlene is a fabulous and talented and persistent human and leader who role models a lot of the values that I aspire to implement in the work that I do, in being highly consultative and engaged with stakeholders, in amplifying voices of people who traditionally haven't been listened to, in doing lots of really skillful networking and liaison. Networking has not ever been a strength of mine, and it's something that I'm actively working on. As an autistic person, it's something that doesn't come naturally to me. Not saying that's the same for all autistic folk, but for me, that's a challenge. And so watching the way that Darlene very skillfully, builds up these incredible relationships and becomes the trusted advisor to very influential folk is something that I aspire to build skills in. And she's also opened a lot of doors for me this year as well, particularly into the ability to start to sit at some tables and be part of conversations that, without having a sponsor or a supporter like Darlene, there's no universe where I would have had the ability to access those kinds of spaces. So for sure, there's lots of other people along the way this year who've, enabled my success in a few different spaces, but that's one that sticks out in my mind at the moment.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, there's those people in our lives are gold and well worth acknowledging as such. Ebe Ganon, thank you so much for speaking with us today, and congratulations once again on being the 2024 recipient of the National Award for Disability Leadership for Change Making.
Thanks, Christina, and all the best. Hope you have a very restful end of year period to be recharged for some more, some more mischief into 2025.
Oh, there's a lot to be done yet. Absolutely. Thank you, Evie.